concept of sanctuary is a deeply ingrained human need. We lock our doors to keep the threats out, but what happens when the very structure meant to protect you becomes a suffocating tomb? When nature itself seals the exits, the illusion of control shatters. Welcome to Dark Coping, where horror meets the mind. Today we are examining the psychological decay, the squandered potential, and the agonizing narrative exhaustion of Netflix's 2026 sci-fi thriller, TheLastHouse. We will dissect how a film with such a suffocatingly brilliant premise completely drowns under the weight of its own structural failures. TheLastHouse traps us in a meticulously curated Seattle suburb. The inciting incident isn't a masked killer, but an unnatural, relentless rainstorm. Jason and Ann Delgado, played effectively by Wagner Moura and Greta Lee, discover the rainwater has formed an impenetrable barrier, inexplicably sealing them and their two children inside. This setup strips away the comforts of modern security, forcing the family into a hyper-claustrophobic pressure cooker. Director Louise Leterrier attempts to navigate the mental deterioration of a family rationing survival. However, as a foundational critique, the film suffers from a severe lack of narrative focus. It routinely abandons its intense psychological study in favor of tedious domestic melodrama. For our non-spoiler verdict, I'm giving it a 2 out of 5. The passage of time entirely obliterates attention. If the film has a fatal flaw, it's the jarring pacing dissonance. The first act sets us up with a gripping claustrophobic dread reminiscent of early pandemic lockdowns, spliced with a desperate fight for survival. But halfway through the runtime, the narrative abruptly jumps forward 5 years. While the initial descent into quarantine establishes a genuinely grim atmosphere, that tension is completely squandered by the time jump. Instead of witnessing the psychological unraveling of the parents, we are subjected to the exhausting mechanics of indoor vegetable gardens and water reclamation. The film stagnates, pivoting away from a terrifying home invasion by the elements into a prolonged, monotonous adolescent drama. I don't think the creatures are a metaphor for anything. I think they are a profound misstep. True psychological dread requires an unseen, creeping pressure, but TheLastHouse ultimately reveals that the aquatic barrier hides tentacled CGI creatures. The resulting visual execution is incredibly hollow, entirely lacking the tangible grit that a story about isolation demands. We stop watching a family slowly losing their grip on sanity and instead find ourselves watching a generic digital creature. It turns a harrowing study of human endurance into a manufactured, emotionally flat monster movie. The real tragedy is that beneath the digital monsters and the tedious survival logistics, a devastating psychological premise is buried. Late in the film, the house literally begins to sink. The family is forced to navigate sewage pipes and reach a deceased neighbor's home to steal antibiotics. This subterranean journey could have been brilliant, dark, and a revelation about desperate lengths a parent will go to. Yet the climax refuses to offer closure. The mystery behind the rain, the global catastrophe, and the creatures remain entirely unresolved. We are dragged through another grueling multi-year survival epic, only for the narrative to end on a blatant cliffhanger designed purely to set up sequels. Because the film abandons its themes for a franchise pitch, this ending lands with a hollow thud. We cannot emotionally invest in a story about survival when the filmmakers treat the finale as a mere commercial placeholder. The Last House attempts to dissect the illusion of safety and the crushing weight of indefinite confinement. Unfortunately, it completely loses its nerve in the execution. By diluting the suffocating psychological dread with repetitive family drama, it betrays its own core concept. When you combine that structural identity crisis with lackluster CGI antagonists and a deliberately incomplete ending, you are left with a piece of media that simulates tension without honoring the humanity required to make it hit home. It is a frustrating, occasionally effective, but ultimately hollow viewing experience. My final score remains a 2 out of 5. I just wish we were given a deeper dive into the family's mental collapse and far less time spent on unemotional digital tentacles. This brings me to a critical question for all of you watching, and one I urge you to consider deeply. When a horror film establishes a heavy, grounded psychological premise, like indefinite isolation, does introducing CGI monsters inherently ruin the atmosphere, or can these elements coexist successfully? I ask that you document your perspectives in the comments section below. Your insights and counter-arguments are vital to the continued study of the genre and why we love it. Next time on Dark Hoping, we will be shifting our focus away from supernatural survival for Constance and I to dissect the cerebral collapse and undertone, as well as breaking down the psychological mechanics of the newest Insidious movie. Until then, this is Dark Hoping. Keep surviving the dark.